I think we just found an oversight with this particular game. Today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Worthy Opponent, a collection of a dozen text-mode turn-based minigames designed to be played over modem connections. Considering modems weren't very common in the late 80s compared to most of the 90s, it's kind of crazy to think this thing exists, or that it made any sort of real money. Before the internet was a thing, and even for a while after, most people with modems had them for sake of productivity, because they were extremely expensive. But in 1986, the prices of modems had begun to drop at a rapid pace, and by 1987 they had become affordable enough for any computer owners who wanted to try out the online services that were out there. But for gaming? Well, it's true that most bulletin board systems had some kind of games available for play online, but these were all limited to terminal-based applications for the most part due to how little data could be transmitted per second. So the majority of early modem games didn't really have any action going on. While all 12 games in Worthy Opponent are still turn-based, most of the games have an action component to them, making them an interesting hybrid between turn-based and real-time gameplay. By today's standards, we would expect both players playing these games to act simultaneously, so it's interesting seeing the dynamics present in this program given the limitations of early modems. Worthy Opponent was created and released by a company known as Future Ideas Today in 1988 and is a two-player minigame collection. That's right, this is the very first game to show up on Ancient DOS Games that does not have single-player support. You absolutely must play this with a friend, though all of the games are capable of being played locally without a modem connection, so at least there's that. To that end, I had a friend of mine helping me with all the game footage this week. It runs in a 16-color 80x25 text mode and has PC speaker sound effects, though unlike the last two games, this one does not support monochrome displays and will lock up if you try to run the program on one. As for its current release date, while it's still technically shareware, the company that made this thing doesn't seem to exist anymore, but the shareware version itself is actually the full program, so it's still possible to get the full experience without registering. The point of registering earlier on was to qualify for free updates and technical support. Finding this game online, though, can be a bit tricky and doesn't show up in any of the places I would usually recommend. So instead, I recommend searching the net for the zip file the game was typically distributed in, worthy20.zip. You might be able to find earlier versions, but the version change from 1.9 to 2.0 was pretty substantial, and for the better, so version 2.0 is definitely the one you want to go for. Now here's something most of you are probably already wondering about. How the heck am I playing a modem-based DOS game from 1988, multiplayer, with a friend who lives about 2,000 kilometers away from me, over the internet? Well, one of the really neat features of dosbox is being able to establish modem, null modem, and IPX networking connections using the typical TCP/IP connections we make over the internet nowadays. So before we move on to the program itself, I'm going to tell you guys how to make this work with null modem connections in dosbox. We'll do IPX another day. For anything modem related, it all comes down to the serial section in your DOSBox configuration file. By default, the first two values are simply set to dummy, which tells software to pretend that there's modems on COM ports 1 and 2, even though there technically isn't, nothing's being emulated. To establish a null modem connection with another computer through DOSBox, you need to set this value to null modem. But that's not actually enough, since in the past, an actual null modem connection was nothing more than two computers linked together with a serial cable. So you need to tell DOSBox how to establish this pretended connection. Basically, one person will have their computer act as a TCP/IP server, while the other will act as a TCP/IP client. The person running the server simply needs to set serial 1 to null modem, and they'll probably want to configure a custom port too, since it will need to be port forwarded through their router. I'm not going to go into how to set up port forwarding since the process is different for virtually every single router out there. But to set up a custom port of, say, 5000, all you need to do is add port:5000 on the same line as the null modem setting. The person acting as the client doesn't need to do any port forwarding, but they will need to tell dosbox which IP address to connect to, which you indicate by adding the server option to the null modem line. So if the person you were connecting to had an IP address of, say, 105.82.1.76, that's the number you'd enter. Just keep in mind that most people's IP addresses will change routinely, so you'll want to be sure to edit this line every time you're about to play the game to make sure you're connecting to the right computer and not someone else's. And yeah, while it might seem a little complicated, it's really not all that bad, it's just inconvenient. Interestingly enough though, dosbox actually has the ability to use real modem hardware or serial ports for making its connections by setting a serial value to direct serial, including the real COM port to use. But the vast majority of computers nowadays simply don't have the hardware to do this, so it almost wasn't even worth mentioning. As for establishing the connection in the game itself using this null modem method, access the call screen and look at the bottom of the phone book for two special commands for originate and answer. One computer, doesn't matter who, should press the answer button and the other person should immediately press the originate button following. If the connection's active and everything's done right, the game should connect both systems and you'll be all set to play. So, let's talk about the games themselves. The first game on the list is Snake Pit, which also happens to be the most broken game on display. The idea is that you have to eat snakes from their back end to get longer, and if someone gets eaten all the way up to their head, they lose. The trouble with this game is that it's very easy for both players to become stuck and have to wait lengthy amounts of time for the computer-controlled snakes to put one of the players out of their misery. The other trouble with this game has to do with the game timer in the bottom corner. Every game has this timer, and when the timer runs out, it becomes the other person's turn. With Snake Pit, the default time per turn is set to 10 seconds, which is actually long enough for the first player to act to immediately run to the other side and completely eat up the opposing snake before they even get a turn. Fortunately, you can set the game timer to different lengths with every game, and even the different lengths for different players, and I recommend a setting of 5 seconds for Snake Pit. The next game is Checkers, which, as you might expect, plays like a typical game of checkers, so not really much to say about this one. The next game is Cannonball Express, and is undoubtedly one of the better games on display. The idea is that players take command of trains armed with a massive array of cannons. You win by destroying every cannon on the opposing player's train. Now, even though you have a massive number of cannons, you're only allowed to fire one at a time, and can select which cannon to fire from, and can fire in 3 directions, straight or at a 45-degree angle in either direction. What helps make this game fun are the power-up trains. If you're able to destroy one entirely, even if you weren't the only one shooting at it, you gain the ability to fire an additional cannon at a time, which can be a real game changer. Destroying more power-up trains will let you fire even more shots, but it's rare for the game to go on long enough for this to happen. This game also highlights something I should draw your attention to for a moment. Many shooting effects go by extremely fast in this program, even though typical movement seems to happen at a normal rate. I'm not sure how intentional this was, considering the turn counters go down by seconds regardless of how long or short the shooting effects last for. Running the program with very low cycles counts in DOSBox actually changes the dynamics of the gameplay, in that you'll get far fewer shots per amount of game time. But considering when this game came out, it's hard to know whether slow shots or fast shots were the intent. So this is more so something I think should be left to the players to decide. I decided to keep things fast. The next game is Cornerstone, which is essentially the exact same game as Othello or Reversi, where the goal is to make the board as much your own color as possible by placing pieces to flip other pieces. Each piece you place down will flip all the pieces between that piece and any of your other pieces on the board that are in line with it. Nothing too complex, but playing this game digitally as opposed to on a real board makes the gameplay much faster. The next game is Backgammon, which plays just like a traditional backgammon game, though it doesn't seem to keep a running score, even though it tracks the state of the doubling die. I guess this kind of makes sense, since every other game in this program doesn't need to keep score, so why add functionality for such things to just a single game? Still, it means players need to track their backgammon scores themselves, which is slightly annoying. The next game is Cave-In, where the goal is to cause rocks from the ceiling to crush all of your opponents by shooting at them. This is kind of a weird one, but for what it is, it works well enough. One nasty trick is to put one of your own guys smack dab in the middle of a group of enemies, or to have them trap enemies beneath them so that your opponent can't take one out without taking out the other. The next game is Quinte, which is kind of like tic-tac-toe, except instead of trying to make a line of 3 in a row, you're trying to make a line of 5 in a row on a much larger board. The strategy involved is much more dynamic here, but it's still very simple to play. The next game is Missile Strike, which is a bit overly complex and not too terribly fun as a result. Basically, it's like Missile Command, in that you're trying to shoot down missiles so that they don't destroy your cities. But at the same time, you have a missile satellite you use to drop missiles on your opponent's city. The trouble with this game is that it's extremely hard to set a good number for the turn timer given the dynamics of the game. If the setting's too short, it's hard to do anything, but if the setting's too long, you have to play incredibly badly to lose. This game would have worked much better had both players been able to act at the same time, but because of the way early modems worked, this would have been very difficult to pull off. The next game is Treasure Quest, and this is an interesting one, though it's hampered by its controls. The goal is to fetch 5 treasures and bring them back to your vault. You can only carry 1 treasure at a time, and if any enemies touch you, you get sent back to your vault without any treasure you happen to be carrying. But one of the neat things about this game is that you can swipe treasures from your opponent when it's not their turn, and you can also set yourself up at the end of your turn to keep yourself or your treasure safe, since enemies die on contact with the treasures and the opponent can't pass through you. The controls, however, work on the concept of pressing a button once to continually move in that direction until you move in a different direction. This game would have worked much better had players been able to push a button once just to move one space, but at the same time, this probably would have unbalanced the game since players wouldn't move at the same speeds anymore. As such, this is a good game, but with a bit of work, it could have been better. The next game is Army Ants. Now, this one's a bit weird. You start off with a queen ant, several drones, and several soldiers. Drone ants dig tunnels, soldier ants can kill other ants by stabbing them, and the queen ant will birth new ants if any of your ants die. At the start of the game, there's not very much you can do other than wait for tunnels to get dug, but once 2 tunnels connect, that's when the action really gets going. The idea is to kill the opponent's queen ant, but there's several things you can do to help prevent this from happening. Since you have direct control over your soldier ants, you can place them in spots in your tunnels where they can't be killed from, since you need at least 1 space in front of your ant to switch directions for attack when you move, plus you can't kill a soldier from their front. You have to hit them from their side or their back. While the game is pretty dynamic, it's also tricky to play and has a surprising amount of luck involved despite its dynamics. The next game, Laser Maze, is kinda dull. Basically, you just have a bunch of guys that can shoot lasers in diagonal directions that bounce off of walls. The goal is to kill all of your opponent's men. Very simple and somewhat mindless in its approach, but at least it's playable. The final game is Miniature Golf, and is definitely one of the more intriguing games on display. The goal is to play 9 holes of a miniature golf course. You hit the ball by first selecting your power by hitting spacebar a number of times. Then you press the direction to hit the ball in. There's a slight amount of randomness to how far your ball will travel at each power level in order to keep the game from becoming too predictable. Plus, if you hit a hole at full speed, the ball will go in as opposed to skipping over the hole like in real miniature golf. While this game is definitely neat, 2 experienced players will likely have the best power levels and directions memorized for each hole before too long, which means it does ultimately come down to luck more than anything. Overall, Worthy Opponent is a worthy collection of multiplayer minigames from the late 80s. Many of these games would have been more fun if they were played simultaneously as opposed to taking turns, but because of the limitations of early modems and the massive differences in speed of early computers, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't be designed that way. For what it is, it's a fun little package, but for the most part, it's been superseded by more modern games, and it's more interesting as a piece of modem gaming history than as something to actually go back and play every so often. Typically, setting the game up in DOSBox is simple enough, as you can just leave cycles set to auto, or set it to a really low fixed cycles count like 300 or 400 if you want projectiles to go slower. You also want to make sure to set serial 1 to null modem if you intend to play the game over the internet with a friend. And as I explained earlier, the person acting as a TCP/IP client will need to put in the IP address of the person acting as a server. Both players will probably want to set up a custom port value, and the person acting as a server will also need to configure their router to port forward the specific port being used. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Episode 119 will be Saturday, August 3rd, and I'll be taking a look at a game that uses isometric 3D graphics, but its predecessor had an overhead view instead. If you think you know which game that is, then send your guess to adg@pixelships.com and stay tuned to check it out.